Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. We imagine more people will trickle in as we get moving here, but we have to cover 2.5 chapters to close out 1 Samuel because this is the last week of this class. It's gone by really fast, but we're going to have to push through this pretty quick. So it is time for us to begin our Bible classes. For any of those of you that are out in the foyers, please make your way to your classrooms so your teachers can get started. As always, welcome to our visitors and those watching on the internet. Glad to have you with us this morning. We last week covered chapters 27, 28, and part of 29 of 1 Samuel. We had to move through pretty quick because I was getting a little behind. In 1 Samuel chapter 27, we learned about how David had, we don't know the exact time frame, but shortly after Saul had assured him that that David would accomplish great things and that he wasn't going to pursue him anymore, David begins to fear for his life again. So he flees from the pursuit of Saul again, fleeing to Gath. When he gets there, he asks Achish for land for him and his 600 fighting men and their families, a place where they can live that is out of the way. So Achish gives him Ziklag. From Ziklag, we read about how David used that as his base of operations, his headquarters, and he conducted raids on the Philistines from that location. Meanwhile, Achish was thinking that David was helping him and conducting battles against the Israelites. We got into chapter 28. We learned about how the Philistines were preparing for a significant battle, a new battle with the Israelites, and Saul was very afraid. Saul inquired of God, but God was silent. So in desperation, Saul sought out a medium, and they ended up finding one in Endor, and she conjures up Samuel so that Saul can talk to him. And it's not clear exactly what Saul was hoping to hear, but he certainly didn't hear what he wanted from Samuel when Samuel told him that Saul and his sons would be killed the next day. So when we left off last week, we had just gotten into chapter 29, and we had talked about the first 5 verses where we were putting ourselves as a fly on the wall of the tent where the leaders of the Philistine armies were planning their attack on Israel. And we had just talked about how 4 of the leaders were not very pleased to see David with Achish at the rear of the field. So we're going to pick up right there and push through 31, and hopefully we'll make it through everything this morning. In verses 1 through 5 of chapter 29, the Philistines have chosen Aphek as a staging point for the consolidation of their armies in preparation for their attack on Israel. Here, each of the 5 Philistine lords come with men under their command. The 4 fellow commanders, as we said, were not impressed by even the confidence that Achish had in David or by his assurances that David was fighting for them. If anything, the answer Achish gave the other commanders, it makes them even more angry at him. They wonder, how can this man be so taken in by David? How can he be so stupid? How can he fail to see what David is really up to in this situation? David is a Hebrew. He is a Hebrew in exile. He will do anything he can to win the favor of King Saul. And how better to accomplish this than to feign loyalty to the Philistines and then turn against them in the heat of battle. Has Achish forgotten David's military genius and might and his popularity among his own people? You have to wonder what they were thinking at that point. So the four commanders don't give Achish any choice. They instruct Achish to send David home, back to Ziklag. He is not going to go into battle with them. Or perhaps more accurately, they are not going to go into battle with him. If Achish wants to continue to offer David asylum in Ziklag, that's good enough. That is a place that is remote enough that David can do little harm there, or conceivably little harm there. So let David be sent back to Ziklag, but he will not be going to war with the Philistine army. In verses 6 through 11, we read about how Achish had the unpleasant task of disappointing David and telling him he must go home. He does so using language unbefitting a true pagan. He uses the term, or the words, "as the Lord lives," in verse 6. And this is not the pagan term for gods that is used here, but the Hebrew term Yahweh, for the one true God, the God of Israel. Later on in verse 9, the Philistine king tells David that he is like an angel of God. These are strange words indeed coming from Achish. It is not David here that is using God talk, if you will, but Achish. It may be that he is carefully choosing his words to accommodate David's faith, or it could be that David's faith is actually having an effect on Achish. It is unclear. But it's almost amusing to read the nice things that Achish says about David. They are so flattering to David and yet so false. Achish tells David that he has been pleasing in his eyes, that from the day he first arrived to stay with him, he has done no wrong against him. Would Achish feel the same way and said the same things if he knew what David had really been doing, whom he had really been raiding and killing, and that all the reports to Achish were false? Probably not. But Achish has more good things to say about David. He tells him that he is like an angel of God in verse 9. Achish is completely taken in by David. And the immensity of David's deception is evident in the words of praise of his king. Achish not only flatters David, he apologizes to him. He explains to David that while he wants David to accompany him to the coming battle with Israel, his four colleagues will have no part of such a plan, and that David and his men will have to return to Ziklag in the morning. This text is, I don't know how to I can't come up with the words for it, but it's amazing to me that if I was in David's sandals at this point, we just talked last week about how he seemed to be in a no-win situation. But if I was in David's shoes here, and I would be very happy that I'd been let off the hook, hearing what Achish had just said. Because here he is in a seemingly hopeless situation, caught between a rock and a hard place. The four Philistine commanders refuse to allow David to go into battle with them, and Achish sheepishly gives David the bad news. But it's really not bad news for David, or it shouldn't be bad news for David. It's fantastic. David does not need to fight with the Israelites, with Saul, or with Jonathan. Neither does David have to fight with Achish or any of the Philistines. All he needs to do is go home to his place in Ziklag. Rather than humbly submit to these orders from Achish and the Philistine commanders, David protests, as though he would talk them out of their decision, as though he is bound and determined to go to war. Given a way of escape here, it seems that David turns it down. If David's words of protest here are merely an act, then David is a magnificent actor. But gratefully, the minds of these four Philistine commanders cannot be changed, so David will return to Ziklag in the morning. So early the next morning, both David and the Philistine warriors arise and get on their way. The Philistines set out for Jezreel, where the Israelites are encamped, and David heads back to Ziklag. David has once again been saved. and this by the angry reaction of the 4 Philistine commanders who overrule the plans of Achish. And then we move into chapter 30 here, and we see what has been happening while David has been gone, while David and his men have been gone. They have some significant problems when they get back. So while David and his men are with Achish and Aphek, the Amalekites are plundering Ziklag. If we have learned anything in this study, it's that failure to completely carry out God's word has devastating consequences. David's raids while based in Ziklag are against the enemies of Israel, which include the Amalekites. Is this raid on Ziklag a retaliation? We don't know, but for whatever reason, the Amalekites take advantage of the military moves of the Philistines and attack virtually defenseless villages and cities, and among them was Ziklag. The city is destroyed, burned to the ground. Providentially, all of the people among Ziklag are spared, along with the cattle. We'll see later that David does not deal so kindly with the Amalekites. But as they draw near to Ziklag, perhaps they begin to see and smell smoke. A growing sense of dread has to fall upon them as they approach the village and see the burned ruins. One can imagine that puzzled looks become looks of alarm, and the noisy chatter ceases, replaced by chilling silence. The city is in shambles. We read it is burned to the ground. There's absolutely no sign of life. Neither are there any bodies lying about. Some may still be alive, but those who are alive may wish they were dead. This actually may be the darkest day of David's life to this point in time. At this moment, no one seems to be thinking of pursuing those who have done this, whoever they might be. The scriptures don't allude to that at all. David's 2 wives have been taken, and so have all the families of his men. The men are grief-stricken. They could not have imagined anything worse. We're told that they all wept until they had no strength to continue. It's obviously this is not a pretty sight, but we read on and we find it gets even uglier. As the apparent reality begins to set in, David's men begin to think about what has happened. And they seem to think it's all David's fault. David brought them to Gath and then to Ziklag. David had them bring their families along. David ordered raids on people like the Amalekites. David's wheeling and dealing got them inducted into the Philistine army. Because of David's relationship with Achish, they are now all far away in Aphek while their own families are terrorized and kidnapped. It seems that they have had just about enough of David and his leadership. They are greatly distressed and ready to vent their anger. And talk begins to circulate about the men, or with the men, about stoning David. At this point, as we move into verses 7 through 10, not since chapter 23 has David sought God's will by means of the ephod. But here in verse 7, we read about how David does consult it. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Please bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. As is often the case, tragedy turns David's heart toward God. This chapter is another one of David's finest hours. David first strengthens himself in the Lord, and then he turns to the Lord for specific direction and guidance concerning their families and those who have kidnapped them. David asked the Lord to reveal whether he should pursue the raiders or those that have taken their loved ones. He asked, will he overtake them if he does pursue them? And the answer to these questions is yes. God assures David he will not only overtake this band, but he will also completely rescue all that has been taken. In this situation, we have to consider the physical and mental condition of these men. They have just traveled nearly 60 miles from Aphek back to Ziklag, no doubt pressing hard to get home as soon as possible. They can rest up at Ziklag once they've arrived, so they think. Then, finding their loved ones kidnapped, their cattle stolen, and their city destroyed by fire, they weary themselves weeping, as we read in verse 4. Now they are off in hot pursuit of an enemy. The enemy raiding party has a substantial lead, and the trail is getting cold. They can easily disappear into the wilderness. If they are to be overtaken in time to rescue their loved ones, David and his men must move quickly. It's judged by the text here. We can imagine that David is having his men march in double time, or even running. As time passes and the heat of the sun works on David and his men, they actually grow weary, we're told. When they come to the brook Besor, a third of the men simply cannot go on. They have plenty of motivation. Their families are in danger, and they want to get there to rescue them. But many of them simply do not have the strength to continue on. 200 men collapse there by the brook, unable to press on. Even if they do go on, they will only slow the rest down. David and the other 400 men press on, leaving much of their gear behind with the 200 so that they can move faster and expend less energy. In verses 11 through 15, we read about a man who is left for dead, who actually gives new life to David's pursuit. The trail is cold. Like we said earlier, the raiders got a head start. It seems that David and his men do not even know who the raiders are at this point. We are told in verse 1, but David and his men seem to learn this information in verses 13 and 14. David and his men must be beginning to wonder what direction their pursuit should take. At a critical moment here, they just happen to stumble across a man who has been left half dead in the field. The man is so weak he cannot talk. It may seem to some that this is a waste of time for David and his men to stop and render aid to this man. Whether this is out of pure compassion, making David a kind of a good Samaritan, or whatever the reason, their efforts are well rewarded. It takes bread and water, then a piece of fig cake and raisins to bring this man back to life, since he has gone 3 days and nights without either food or water. When the man has recovered enough and finally has sufficient strength to speak, David, he begins to question him. The answers to his questions must lift the spirits of David and his men, for the man tells him that he is an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. His master left him behind 3 days earlier because he was sick and slowing everyone down. His master left him there to die, with no food and no water. He then tells David he is with the Amalekite raiding party that plundered Ziklag. So David then asks the young man if he would be willing to guide them to the Amalekite camp. Normally, you would think that this man would not consider such a thing, but since his master and others had left him behind to die, he is willing to cooperate in exchange for David's assurance that he will not be killed or handed back over to his master. So this half-dead servant gives new life to David's search for the Amalekite raiders and their captives. As we move through verses 16 through 20, we read about the rescue of all this David's men's families, including his wives. There was no longer any need to track this raiding party. Thanks to the Egyptian slave whom they revived, they would now be guided directly to the camp. David and his men arrive at the raiders' camp to find the Amalekites totally vulnerable. After all, the Philistines, along with David and his men, they suppose, and the Israelites are far away to the north at war, so they figure who would come after them. They enjoy a successful mission, and now they come home where they can indulge themselves with the fruits of their victories. We're told in verse 16 that the Amalekites are spread all over the land. implying that they are not tightly assembled in a defensive posture. The Amalekites are eating and drinking and dancing, we're told. In short, they are likely too drunk to stand up straight, much less fight. If this is the Amalekite base camp, then there will be more people here than just the raiding party. David and his men are thus greatly outnumbered, but given the drunken state of the Amalekite warriors, they are easy prey. David and his men attack, a slaughter that lasts for many hours, we're told. Not a single person escapes, except the 400 men who flee on camels. Everything and everyone the Amalekites had taken from Ziklag is recovered. David and his men suffer no losses except for what had been burned at Ziklag. David's 2 wives are among the hostages rescued, and the author is very specific that nothing is missing. David brings it all back, just as God had indicated to him. They have overtaken their enemy and prevailed. This obviously could not have been a more successful mission. One would think at this point that everything is all good. But in verses 21 through 31, we read that that's not the case. Even with this decisive victory, troubles still abound. The victory is now won, and everything that was lost has been recovered. In fact, not only have David and his men recovered everything they've lost, but they've actually gained a whole lot more. They gained the spoils of the Amalekites obtained by their raids on the Philistines and Israelite towns. These spoils now present David with a major problem. Some of the 400 men who have defeated the Amalekites are refusing to share the spoils with the 200 men who stayed behind, those that we read about that could not go on. Only a segment of the 400 men who fought with the Amalekites are wicked and worthless men. Not all of the 400 are this way, just some of them. But these wicked, worthless men, as we read in the text, seem to take charge. Their reasoning goes something like this. Only 400 men did the actual fighting. The other 200 had no part in the battle or in the victory that was won. So the 200 should be given back what they lost, but they should not be given a portion of the extra spoils of war, the spoils the Amalekites took from the Israelites and the Philistines. These extra spoils, they feel, should be divided only among the 400 that traveled to the battle. The refusal of these men to share any of their spoils with the 200 seems to be based on several faulty assumptions, one of which is they assume that the spoil is theirs to divide as they please, and they make it clear they are refusing to share any of their spoils with the 200. They assume that the 200 men have had no part in this battle or this victory, just because they were not with the 400 when they actually fought and won the battle with the Amalekites. They assume that the victory was indeed their victory, something for which they could take credit, a victory for which they should expect a reward. These men are not asking for a bigger share of the spoils, they are demanding it. They are not asking for David's leadership either. They are usurping it, or at least attempting to do so. We read here that David does not let these wicked men prevail. He takes the initiative in dealing with their demands and handles them very well. He refuses to allow these men to have their way, while showing them that he shows them why they are wrong in what they demand. In David's reasoning, he points out that they have not earned these spoils as this group supposes. The victory and the spoils are a gracious gift from God. God gave these spoils, just as he gave them the victory. David points out that the victory is a team victory, and that the team is greater than the 400 in number. When David employs the word us, it seems clear that he includes all 600. God gave the victory to us, we read. David's 600 men are all brothers, in verse 23. This is not just a collection of individuals, it is a brotherhood. These 600 men are a family. And David points out that the battle is a team effort, with each member playing a different role. Just because 200 stayed behind does not mean that they had no part in the victory. They stayed with the baggage. And as I understand reading the text, the baggage of the 600 men so that the others could travel a lot more lightly and faster. So thus they did contribute to the victory. Their victory is a collective victory, and so every man should have an equal share of the spoils. So David, we read there, he refuses to let these wicked and worthless men spoil the victory God has given. He sees to it that the spoils of war are evenly dispersed among the 600 men. But the 600 do not get all of the spoils of that victory. In verses 26 through 31, we see that David makes very good use of some of the spoils by sharing them with some of the Israelite towns he and his men frequented. David's decision here it's far-reaching, and more so than he realizes at this moment, likely. And we have covered over the last 11 weeks, I guess, that many of David's decisions have been far-reaching. An example, David never imagined what the outcome would be for deciding to flee to the Philistines for safety. He never imagined that the consequences of standing up to Goliath and killing him. In the heat of the moment, David had a decision to make. Should he give in to a few wicked and worthless men here, letting them divide the spoils among the 400, or should he stand up for what's right? David chooses to stand up for what is right, and in the process, he establishes a principle which actually outlives him. The good or the evil, which we choose to do, does set a precedent for the future. As we move into chapter 31, how are we doing on time? Okay. We actually come to the point where Saul dies. In verses 1 through 3, I actually want to read this text. 1 Samuel 31, verses 1 through 3. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchi-Shua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. When David and his men part ways with the Philistines at Achish, the Philistines head north to Jezreel, while David and his men turn south towards Ziklag. Considering the distances here, it's conceivable that they reach their destinations about the same time. This means that Saul and the Israelite army are fighting the Philistines just about the time David and his men are in pursuit of the Amalekite raiders. We know that this is at least approximately the case, since we are told that David learns of Saul's death on the third day after he and his men had arrived back at Ziklag, victorious over the Amalekites, in 2 Samuel chapter 1. God providentially removes David from this conflict by occupying his attention further away to the south. David is thus not allowed to fight with or against the Philistines. It is God's will that this battle between Israel and the Philistines will win and Saul and his sons will die in battle. Many, as you read that text there, many of the tragic details of this battle are omitted. The men of Israel flee from the attacking Philistines. Many Israelite soldiers fall dead on Mount Gilboa. Whatever defense shield they were provided, or what they provided for Saul, now collapses in verse 5. The Philistines begin to press their attack against Saul and his sons. Saul may have retreated to the highest, most protected spot on Mount Gilboa, looking on in terror while his sons attempt to provide the last line of defense for their father. As we read, though, this effort fails, and the 3 sons of Saul lay dead as the archers spot Saul and begin to use him for target practice. None of Saul's wounds are instantly fatal, as is often the case with archery injuries, though Saul is no longer able to attack or even defend himself. It is only a matter of time, and Saul knows it. So as we move into verses 4 through 6, let's read this text as well, verses 4 through 6. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and pierce me through with it. Otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men on that day together. Saul's request here is actually more of a command. He instructs his armor-bearer to draw his sword and to run him through with it. And this is not such an unusual request then or now. We remember the story from the book of Judges, 9th chapter, where Abimelech makes the same request. Abimelech is one of the many sons of Gideon, though his mother is a concubine. He convinces his relatives in Shechem to make him their ruler, and then kills 70 brothers on one stone in verses 1 through 5. And then the relationship between the leaders of Shechem and Abimelech turns sour, which results in a battle. Abimelech defeats the men of Shechem and surrounds the leaders in the city tower. Abimelech is in the process of burning them out when a woman drops an upper millstone from the tower and strikes Abimelech in the head. And he is critically wounded in this situation and knows he is dying, but to avoid the stigma of having been put to death by a woman, he orders his armor-bearer to draw his sword and kill him. The young man with him obliges, and he dies. Abimelech's death is far from noble, and it is not a precedent to which anyone would likely appeal. But Saul here is in a similar situation. A number of the Philistine arrows find their mark, and Saul is critically wounded. One way or another, Saul knows he's about to die. So he orders his armor-bearer to finish him off. He gives 2 reasons for this, which he seems to feel are pretty compelling. One was he does not want to die at the hand of some uncircumcised heathen. And 2, he does not want his enemies to be able to make sport of him, in verse 4. His reasons are not compelling enough for Saul's armor-bearer, however. We read that he does not want to do it. One would hope to hear a response from the armor-bearer which mentions the fact that Saul is the Lord's anointed, but we don't see that. We cannot be certain, therefore, that the armor-bearer refuses to act out of principle, but we are told that he fails to act out of fear. In fact, we are told he is greatly afraid in verse 4. Saul is desperate. He has no strength left to fight the Philistines and very little strength to kill himself. There is one thing he can do in this situation. He can fall on his own sword, which he does. However, as we get into 2 Samuel, we see that he doesn't even do this right. Saul actually misses. Not only does Saul miss David with his spear at least twice, and Jonathan, his own son, he can't even take himself out with his own sword. I say this not because of what we read in chapter 31, but what we actually find in 2 Samuel chapter 1. We know from the Amalekites' words that Saul does not finish the job of killing himself in this situation. A young man comes upon Saul leaning on his spear. We read in verse 6 of 2 Samuel chapter 1. Saul tries to do himself in and simply cannot do the job right. If God would not allow Saul to take the life of David, God's anointed, neither will he allow Saul to take his own life, for he too is God's anointed. What Saul's armor-bearer will not do to Saul, he does to himself. The armor-bearer dies, leaving Saul alone, at least for a moment. In verses 7 through 10, we read about the aftermath of defeat. Excuse me. Let's go ahead and read that section there. Sorry, I deleted it from my text here, so I'm going to call it back up. Okay. Yes, verses 7 through 10. When the men of Israel, who were on the other side of the valley, with those who were beyond the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and lived in them. It came about on the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. Moving on into verses 11 through 13. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose and walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted for 7 days. This text it's not a pretty sight, nor is it a happily ever after fairy tale ending. But it shows, but it is how it all ends for Saul. Lest the reader here be overcome with sadness over the indignities Saul suffers and the defeat and death which comes to Israel, the author gives a heartwarming account of a very courageous act here on the part of the men of Jabesh-Gilead. When these men learn that Saul and his sons have been killed and that their bodies have been publicly displayed on the wall at Bethshan, they know what they must do. They march through the night to Bethshan and then return to Jabesh-Gilead. This is probably more than a 20-mile round trip. They take down the bodies of Saul and his sons and carry them all the way back to Jabesh. There they burn the bodies and then bury the bones under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh. What prompts the men of the city to do that of which no one else even thought? The people of the city hold fond memories of Saul and his contribution to them. The incident is described in 1 Samuel chapter 11. Nahash, commander of the Ammonites, and his army besieged Jabesh-Gilead and demand their surrender. In that situation, it was more than just an unconditional surrender. He demands, he insists that he gouge out the right eye of every Israelite in the city. The elders of Jabesh ask for some time to think about it and to appeal to their brethren for help. Word gets out to Israel and reaches Saul's ear, who, though he is still working at home, has been appointed king of Israel. Saul becomes angry in the spirit and cuts up his oxen, sending pieces to every tribe in Israel. He warns that everyone who does not appear to defend Jabesh-Gilead will find his oxen slaughtered as well. Israelites, and we're told, numbering 330,000, show up for battle, and the city of Jabesh is rescued. In verses 8 through 10, we see that Saul does not get what he wants. He does not receive what he asks from his armor-bearer in the twofold request, where he says he does not want to be killed by the uncircumcised, and he does not want anyone to make sport of him. Saul is not granted his request. First, we read in 2 Samuel chapter 1 that he is killed by the uncircumcised. Saul's sword does not kill him, nor does the sword of his armor-bearer. The arrows of the Philistines and the sword of an Amalekite kill Saul. Saul is indeed killed by uncircumcised hands. This is all as God meant it to be and how God said it would be in 1 Samuel chapter 28. It is not a matter of coincidence that Saul is killed by the hands of the Philistines and by the hand of an Amalekite. It's kind of a poetic justice, as described here. Saul is reaping what he himself has sown. He has killed the uncircumcised hands. He is killed by the uncircumcised hands because God said that it is the way he would die. No matter how hard Saul tries to change his destiny, he cannot succeed in thwarting God's will or God's word. In his death, not one more attempt to disobey God, one final act of rebellion. Like the first, Saul's second request that the enemies not make sport of him is denied. First, Saul is hit by a number of Philistine arrows, which literally drain the life out of Saul. His slow, agonizing death is not a pretty sight. Saul does not go out looking good. After Saul is dead, his armor is stripped from his body and his head cut off. The Philistines must really enjoy this part. And then they take Saul's armor and his head and parade them around their cities, taking them to the temple of their God. All of this mocks not only Saul, but his God. The men of Jabesh, oops, I got myself all messed up here. No wonder. Excuse me. That'll teach me to type it up this way. Okay. Got my last pages all confused. The men of Jabesh do not forget what Saul did for them. In their hour of need, Saul came with the help that saved them. Now, in Saul's hour of need, they need to find a way to help him. So they actually seek out the bodies of Saul and his sons. They see them suspended on the walls of Bethshan, and they are there to be mocked at that point. The men of Jabesh march through the night, taking down the bodies of Saul and his sons, and bring them back to Jabesh, where they bury him. A magnificent gesture of appreciation and respect on their part. As Saul's boldness toward the Ammonites at Jabesh is Saul's finest hour so far, this is the finest hour for the men of Jabesh. One of the most important lessons we can take from this text this morning is that God's will be done. That's really sums up the entire text we've covered from 1 Samuel 16 on through 31. God's will be done. Saul died just as God said he would. The timing of Saul's death is precisely as predicted. Saul dies in the manner God said he would. He dies at the hands of the Philistines and an Amalekite. Saul dies in a manner entirely consistent with the way he lived his life. Even at the very end of his life, Saul does not really die like a man of courage. He does not want to suffer the pain, and so he begs others to take his life and even tries to do it himself. God's word it's absolutely reliable. God will do as he has promised. He does everything on purpose. He will deal with the sin and rebellion in judgment. He will deal with trust and obedience in blessing. Saul is removed from his throne and from life. David is preserved from Saul's plots and soon installed as a king of Judah and then of Israel. Before the first man ever sinned, God declared that the penalty for sin was death. From that point on, God has spoken clearly to men with respect to sin. His word not only defines sin, it spells out the consequences for sin, which is death. And we see that in Romans chapter 3, verse 23. And second, we can gain insight into our text as we consider the parallel text in 1 Chronicles chapter 10. The first 12 verses of Chronicles 10 are virtually identical to our text that we read this morning. These verses make several matters, except for verses 13 and 14, which they're not there. These verses make several matters implied in 1 Samuel absolutely clear. In the final analysis, men did not put Saul to death, whether Philistine, Israelite, or Amalekite. It was God. And they also inform us that God put Saul to death because of his sin, his persistent sin. And finally, we are told that God put Saul to death not only to fulfill his warnings to him, but also to fulfill his promises to David. And that concludes 1 Samuel. I appreciate all of you coming and your attention the past 12 weeks. I know we're going to have some more good classes starting up next week. But thank you again for your time, and have a good service.